Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shepard-Natze, and even today we can't get past Snowden. Edward Snowden has intentionally or unintentionally put the relationship between Russia and the United States on ice. The fact is, the whistleblower is on Russian territory and is asking for an asylum while the United States is demanding his immediate arrest and extradition. In the current mood of uncertainty and chilliness between the two states, what is really at risk?
A legacy of rivalry. Russia-US ties are continuously tested, never more so than now. The squabble over Snowden has fueled the crossfire, while presidents seek to preserve partnership and promote peace. What are the sore points in the relationship? Can the post-Cold War giants catch the same wave? What is at stake for Russia and America, and for the international community as a whole?
So our guest is Stephen Cohen, Professor of Russian Studies and History at New York University and Princeton University. Stephen, it's really great to have you with us today.
I'm happy to be with you, Sophie.
Right, so at this point, who is Snowden more of a problem for, the United States or Russia?
Well, in my perspective, he's a problem for both. If we put this in historical context, since the end of the Soviet Union 22 years ago, we've lost several opportunities to create a meaningful cooperative relationship between Washington and Moscow. It appeared a few weeks ago that we had another opportunity. The opportunity began with a tragedy, the bombings in Boston, when it was clear that we needed a lot of cooperation in counterterrorism between Moscow and Washington. And then, as the Syrian civil war, or whatever it is, spun out of control, certainly the worst crisis in the Middle East in many years, it also appeared that Washington and Moscow were ready to try to do something about that. And then came Snowden. Not only Snowden, but he clearly is a setback, and I would say both for President Putin and President Obama.
But do you think that Putin is handling the Snowden situation wisely?
Well, what makes this very interesting is that President Putin is a man who likes to control the environment in which he makes international and, I suppose, domestic decisions. He couldn't control this. Snowden came literally out of the blue, and he had to decide what to do. So he was caught, and he remains caught between two very strong countervailing factors. On the one hand, Putin pursues in the world what I would call not an anti-American foreign policy, but an un-American foreign policy. That is, or a non-American foreign policy. That is, a foreign policy rather different from the United States in many areas. Therefore, he could not turn Snowden, a highly symbolic figure, over to the United States. On the other hand, it's absolutely clear that Putin wants some kind of cooperative relationship with the United States. I think he's probably done as good as he can do. As I understand it, the solution is to allow Snowden to remain in Russia in some status of temporary asylum while he sorts out how he's going to go to a third country, Venezuela or someplace. That's a legal issue. That is to say, he needs travel documents, and probably he has to go to the embassy of that country in Moscow. But though it's legal, it's profoundly political. In a way, American-Russian relations at the moment hinge on that. And as I said the other day to an American who asked me, I think this tests the leadership ability, not only of Putin, but of Obama, to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. You brought up an interesting point, saying that Putin likes to control the situation. Do you think he would have acted differently if he wasn't confronted with the sheer fact of Snowden being in Russia, on Russian soil?
Well, I mean, all leaders, real leaders, state leaders, try to control the environment in which they make decisions. But very often they can't. Wars come, acts of terrorism come, leaders change in other countries with whom they were doing business. What we don't know about the Snowden affair is whether or not the Chinese, when they allowed Snowden to fly to Moscow from Hong Kong, cleared it with the Russian end. Whether the Russians said, okay, send him along. If that happened, and we don't know, but I would guess it did, because the Chinese-Russian relationship is very important and very close at the moment. I would assume that whoever in Moscow made that decision, and it might not have been President Putin, he can't make every decision before it becomes a crisis. They may have assumed in Moscow that, in fact, Snowden was going to do as Snowden thought he was going to do, spend maybe 10 hours in the transit section of Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, and then get on a plane to Havana and on, at that time, he thought, to Ecuador. And then a problem arose with Ecuador, and he's still in Moscow. So in that sense, we don't know if Putin said, okay, let him travel through Moscow, not knowing he was going to become a kind of resident in Moscow.
Given the things the way they are right now, what does Russia risk if it gives Snowden an official refugee status?
Well, there's a very, very, as you know, strong anti-Kremlin, anti-Putin, anti-Russian lobby in Washington. And its citadel is the United States Congress. That's why we get preposterous legislation like the Magnitsky Act. Congress is prepared to do anything to strike at Russia. Yesterday, for example, one of the senators proposed that the United States boycott the Winter Olympics in Russia in 2014. That won't happen. But the mere fact that a United States senator, who's supposed to be a person of wisdom and dignity, would propose such a preposterous thing shows you what kind of Congress we're dealing with. So I predict, and I think any idiot could predict, I don't claim great credit for this, that when, and I assume it's when, Snowden is given temporary asylum in Moscow, that members of Congress, members of the various anti-Russian lobbies like Freedom House in the United States and many others will denounce the Kremlin and demand that Obama do something very bad to Russia. And then Obama will be tested. We will see if he can withstand that or not. That's why I say, by the way, that I think this is a kind of test, not only of the wisdom and leadership of Putin, but the wisdom and leadership of Obama. I mean, mind you, Obama didn't ask for this Snowden crisis. Putin didn't ask for it. They just got it.
Another thing with this story is that media right now is more focused on Snowden's future, on what he eats, what he wears, where he lives, where his girlfriend is, than his revelations in the leaks. Can we expect the attention turning back to actually NSA and PRISM, or is it the issue now buried under the Snowden narrative?
Well, you raised what for me is the fundamental question. What we, that is we Americans, should be doing now, ever since Snowden made these revelations, is having a big, open public debate about whether or not we approve of these massive, intrusive surveillance programs by American intelligence agencies. And of course, Europe and Russia and other countries who've been surveilled have to make that decision too. But first and foremost, this is a question for Americans. Is it compatible with our concept of democracy, of civil liberties, of privacy? Or, on the other hand, do we need these kind of abuses of civil liberties to protect ourselves against terrorism? There are two sides to this issue. It's a complicated issue. And Snowden wanted to trigger a debate, and he's failed because, as you say, the drama of the personal saga of Edward Snowden. What's going to happen to him? Where is he going to go? Where is his girlfriend? He looks so young. All these personal dramas, and I would guess that Snowden, who seems to be a very serious and purposeful man, is himself disappointed because his purpose, he says, and I believe him, in making these revelations was to initiate a conversation in the United States about these practices, these surveillance practices, which, because of his own drama, hasn't happened yet, and it may never happen. And Sophie, let me add a matter that is absolutely never discussed in the United States, but it's profound. Obama says, the United States government says, the senators say, the media say, Snowden should come home and stand trial. Well, in some ways, if he could get a fair trial, if he could be out on bail, the way, say, Daniel Ellsberg was 30 years ago when he took the Pentagon Papers, if he could be out on bail, Snowden, while he's preparing his trial, and he could tell his story, and he could build a legal team, and he could have an open court case with all the rights that defendants have, that means that he could subpoena all sorts of officials of the United States government involved with this surveillance, right up to the Vice President and the President of the United States. I cannot imagine that the Obama administration or any U.S. administration would permit that. Therefore, I doubt very seriously that Obama is sincere when he says Snowden should come home and stand trial. But I would guess that if Snowden were given those guarantees of being out of prison and on bail, and free to have an open trial, he might come home. But he's not going to get those guarantees, I would guess, because we live in a different era here in America, too.
You know, I want to talk a little bit more about how that has changed. The whole NSA leaks have changed American society, because if you talk about me and people around me who have like a post-Soviet hangover or a Soviet childhood, I mean, these revelations were life-changing for us because we suspect surveillance in some form or another. Like many RT viewers are strongly against any form of surveillance, our audience. But still, I know a lot of Americans that are around and they're saying, hey, on this point, we're done with the government. For example, Larry King told me the same thing, that he's actually siding with the government on surveillance. What do you see around you? Are the people still shocked or already digesting and accepting it in the name of the war on terror?
Well, I think it depends on, I speak now, I mean, I understand what you're saying about your Russian colleagues. Though surveillance is a problem in Russia, too, and has been for decades. And there's a debate in the Russian media about whether the FSB, the Russian intelligence agency, is doing too much or too little. And let's be fair, people in Russia and in the United States are afraid of terrorism. If you asked me, would I allow the United States government to listen to my phone calls and read my email if they're going to prevent my children from being killed in a terrorist explosion in New York City where I live? Undoubtedly, I would say yes. I'd just be a little more careful what I said on the phone and what I wrote on an email. But this is a major question, and times have changed. I'm old enough to remember the Ellsberg case, when he took the Pentagon Papers, which documented all the Pentagon and the White House lying about the war in Vietnam, and then the New York Times published them, and then they were published very quickly as a book. And Ellsberg was on the radio and the television as it existed then, and he was out on bail, and famous lawyers came to defend him. And in the end, he was exonerated in a way. He won in the courts. That America doesn't exist anymore, partly because of what happened in 9/11, but partly because we fought so many wars, many Americans are afraid, and we've become more accustomed, decade by decade, to this kind of surveillance. So the question that Snowden raises is, should we have become accustomed to it? Is this really a trade-off between our fears and our privacy that we want to make? But I agree with you. The polls have shown that, I don't remember the last number that the polls revealed, but about half of Americans, maybe more, were okay with what the government was doing. But Sophie, you know as well as I do that when you take a public opinion poll, you can get the answer you want by the way you ask the question. If you say in general to Americans, are you prepared to give up all the freedoms that Americans have fought for 200 years and allow the government to do this kind of possibly illegal surveillance, a majority would say no. But if you ask people, are you prepared to permit this surveillance so that you and your children are safe, a majority is going to say yes. It's just in how you ask the question. And you can't ask the question until you've had the national discussion, which we haven't had, which the government doesn't want, but what Snowden wanted, but again, which until Snowden's personal drama ends, or at least calms down, is off the front page, we're not going to have that discussion in this country. And even then we might not have it because the government doesn't want it.
Is it a trade-off? I'm afraid it's a question that's going to be unanswered for a while. It's time for a short break. Coming up next, does U.S. treat Russia as equal? And the Cold War aftershocks, are they still here? Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. We talk about Edward Snowden and how his Moscow detour may affect the already shaky relationship between Russia and the United States. Our guest is Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian Studies and History. Good to have you back, Stephen. So, in your latest opinion editorials, you keep saying that Russia and the United States are at a fatal crossroads. Is this Snowden case icing on a cake? Could things get really bad after this?
I have a historical perspective. Let me state it again. 22 years after the end of the Soviet Union, we do not have a good relationship with Russia. Nobody asks why, or rather, in the United States, when people ask why, they say it's the fault of Russia. Now they say it's the fault of Putin. But this is not a correct or certainly a complete answer. We had several opportunities to establish a partnership with Russia in international affairs. The first came in the 1990s after the end of the Soviet Union, and Clinton and Yeltsin lost that opportunity. The second opportunity came after 9/11, when Putin called President George Bush and said, "We're with you. What can we do to help the United States, which has been attacked by terrorism? We're partners." That opportunity was lost. Then came, just a few years ago, Obama's so-called reset with then President Medvedev, and that opportunity was lost. Now, the tragic bombings in Boston and the tragic civil war in Syria have impressed both Washington and Moscow that we need a cooperative relationship. That is, they created yet another opportunity. It's not clear we would be able to seize that opportunity. But Snowden, and not only Snowden, the Magnitsky Act and other events, but these recent events, most recently Snowden, now become obstacles on both sides to seizing this opportunity. The larger reason, in my opinion, but it's a minority opinion in America, is that what we knew, my generation knew, as the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States either didn't actually end with the Soviet Union or it's come alive again. Because everything we see in American-Russian relations since the end of the Soviet Union looks, smells, behaves like a Cold War relationship. It's just in the United States, our leaders don't want to admit this failure, that they lost the opportunity of the post-Cold War Russia to create a new relationship, a partnership with Russia. And that's where we are today. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think historians will tell you in the future, and as a historian today, I will tell you that we can't understand Snowden, we can't understand Magnitsky, we can't understand these recent conflicts without putting them in the historical context of the relationship between America and post-Soviet Russia during the last 22 years. This is a narrative that hasn't stopped.
All I'm saying is that you've just demonstrated that obstacles and opportunities to get two countries closer or get them more apart arise all the time. And these talks of the Cold War have been around forever, for the past 15 years. You seem to be pointing out that, we are now at a fatal crossroads. I mean, how much worse are things now than during Bush era? Because it seemed like really they were at the lowest then.
Well, the low point of the relationship since the end of the Soviet Union was, of course, the war in Georgia in 2008. And the reason that that was a low point is that the United States and Russia came close to hot war, not just Cold War. Georgia began the war. There's no doubt about that. Russia reacted by moving into South Ossetia. It began to fight with a Georgian army that was, in effect, an American proxy army. We created that army, we armed it, we trained it. There were American minders, military advisors somewhere in Georgia, maybe traveling with the Georgian troops. There was a discussion in the White House, led by Dick Cheney, that the United States should bomb the Russian army in South Ossetia.
Yeah, but when it came down to it, no one really stood up for a Georgian army there on the ground, because no one really wants to wage a war with Russia. That's another example. That's another example of how America and Russia would never really actually go to war.
Well, I don't know about that, Sophie. I mean, where is that written? That we would never go to war. We were extremely close in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were extremely close in Berlin on a number of occasions. There are probably occasions that we haven't been told about. And in my judgment, we were close in Georgia in 2008. No fault of Russia. But how many times can we avoid these dangerous possibilities? So my point is, it's the duty of leadership, American leadership and Russian leadership, to create a relationship where these dangers don't appear. And we haven't done that yet. And I will say, as an American patriot, the primary fault, not the entire fault, but the primary fault is in Washington. Until American policy toward Russia changes, things will not get better. They will not. And American policy toward Russia has not changed on one fundamental issue. Washington believes in what it calls selective cooperation. And that means Russia should make concessions and Washington does not have to make concessions in return. Until that policy changes, nothing else will change. About that, I am absolutely sure.
But does it mean that they don't want a better relationship with Russia? They don't simply care enough to ameliorate their relationship with Russia? Things are good as they are?
I don't mean we, because it's not me, but the American political policy media establishment wants a good relationship with Russia, of course, but it wants it on America's own terms. And it's very clear what that means, because it's meant the same thing since the end of the Soviet Union. Russia should be a junior and subservient partner to American interests. Whatever is in American interest, Russia should help promote. So if America decides to expand NATO to Russia's borders, Russia should accept that as a very good idea for its own security. If Russia decides to build missile defense installations in Europe or on ships that threaten Russia's nuclear security, Russia should understand that that's really against North Korea and Iran, and it doesn't affect Russia. If the United States believes that overthrowing Assad in Syria will bring peace to the Middle East, Russia should agree. The problem is Russia doesn't agree. Russia's a different civilization. The bad precedent was set, I don't like to criticize your leaders because they're your problems, by Yeltsin, who agreed to almost everything. And so Washington got in the habit of getting what it wanted. But even Ambassador McFaul has said on several occasions during the reset, which he claims to have invented, we're going to negotiate with Moscow and see what they can do to promote our national interest. Fine, but that's one hand clapping. A real negotiation, real diplomacy is not that. It is that we go to Moscow and say, here are our interests, will you help us? And then Moscow says, we might, here are our interests, will you help us? And then they do something for each other. Washington doesn't do anything. I would defy anybody who thinks I'm being unpatriotic to tell me one major concession that Moscow has received from Washington since the end of the Soviet Union. Just one. And when I ask this question at august meeting places of the American establishment, I get one answer. Well, we gave them financial loans in the 1990s. Yeah, they were onerous loans, which only Putin, because of high oil prices, could finally pay back. Unlike with Poland, where Washington forgave its communist-era debt, Washington never forgave any of Moscow's debt. We have never given Russia anything. And by the way, Putin says that over and over and over again, and Washington says, why is he so anti-American? He's not anti-American. He's just making a simple point that any major leader would make, that a relationship is a two-way relationship. We give something to you, you give something to us, and we go forward and solve problems. We don't have that relationship, and we haven't had it since the Soviet Union ended. By the way, oddly, we had it with the Soviet Union, but that's another story.
Really quickly, because we're running out of time. So the reset idea, is it all forgotten and dead now?
Well, in America, it's a pejorative, as something that Obama's enemies use to show how unwise he is and say it failed. The reality is Obama got what he wanted from the reset. He got Russian help in supplying NATO forces in Afghanistan. He got tougher sanctions against Iran. He got Moscow's cancellation of that S-300 defense system, I think. The problem is, once again, Sophie, you tell me, if you can think of it, what did Moscow get in return? Nothing. They wanted a compromise on missile defense. They wanted an end to NATO expansion. And they wanted an end to American democracy promotion in Russia. And Washington refused. So the reset failed, but Washington got what it wanted. Now we're starting all over again, or we thought we were before Snowden, with a new, we used to call it détente during the old Cold War, with a new détente. But it's going to fail unless American policy changes. It's a sad story, but it's a true story.
That was Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian Studies and History. Thanks for a great chat. I'm Sophie Shepard-Nadze. I will see you in our next edition of Sophie & Co.